Hello and good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7 here in Broadcasting Scotland. My name is Donald C. Stewart, and after 3 very busy days at the SNP conference, we're all back in Glasgow presenting our nightly programme with regards to the current news. I am absolutely delighted that tonight I am joined by East Lothian MSP Paul McLennan, who is joining us remotely this evening. It's great to see you, Paul, and welcome.
Good evening, good to see you, and like yourself, enjoyed conference and back ready to go.
So, continued alarming news comes from Ukraine, with the death toll from Monday's Russian missile attacks on a swathe of Ukrainian cities risen to 19 people. Over 100 wounded, according to figures from the Ukrainian State Emergency Services. Strikes continued today with an attack on the Lviv region in western Ukraine, which left parts of the city without electricity. A power station in Lezhin in the Vinnytsia region was struck this morning by 2 kamikaze drones. Valentin Reznichenko, the governor in Dnipro, in a note of defiance, has claimed that the air defence systems had shot down 4 missiles targeted at the region. With regards to the nuclear option, which has been troubling most of us over the last few days and weeks, in the UK, Jeremy Fleming, who is the head of the GCHQ, said that he has not seen any indicators that Russia is preparing to use a tactical nuclear weapon in or around Ukraine, despite recent bellicose statements from Vladimir Putin. Vadim Pristaiko, Ukraine's ambassador to the UK, has said that Russia is running out of sophisticated weapons and using missiles like dumb bombs. In the region, Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, leader of the democratic opposition in Belarus, has called on Russian soldiers to leave the country. Warnings have been issued to Belarus that they could face more sanctions if it decides to get more involved in the Ukrainian conflict, coming from France's Foreign Affairs Minister Catherine Colonna, who told French radio that there was a distinct possibility that if Belarus did get more involved, that would follow. Of the attacks in Ukraine, a spokesman for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has said, "We are gravely concerned that some of the attacks appear to have targeted critical civilian infrastructure, indicating that these strikes may have violated the principles on the conduct of hostilities under international humanitarian law." Further condemnation came, mass bombardments of Ukrainian cities by Russia constituting war crimes under international law, according to the presidents of the Bucharest 9 group of countries, accompanied by the presidents of both North Macedonia and Montenegro. Heightening tension has led to Ukraine's ambassador to the UN, Sergei Kyslytsya, calling Russia a terrorist state at a General Assembly meeting on Monday night. While seriousness underlined, the International Committee of the Red Cross confirmed its teams have paused their field work in Ukraine for reasons of security. As a form of aid, the European Union has announced that it will extend an EU-wide protection scheme for Ukrainian refugees in 2024, and that was day 226 of the war in Ukraine. 230. Paul, very worrying times for all of us, I think, who are sitting here looking at Ukraine from a distance. But interesting there to see, particularly, I think, at the conference at the weekend, our First Minister making sure that we had a haven for those who wish to flee from the conflict and come amongst us.
Yeah, Duncan, it was. Obviously, we had a Ukrainian MP with us. Obviously, we heard yesterday from the First Minister's speech talking around about Scotland being a welcoming place, and I think originally Scotland said it would take 3,000 people. We're now looking at 20,000 people who've got in Scotland, which is around about a fifth to a quarter of the total UK target. So yeah, I mean, Scotland has been very welcome, and it is a worrying time in terms of where we are, and I think you are seeing increasing Russian desperations in regards to the advances by the Ukrainians. But it's an incredible worrying time. But the key message I think coming through from the conference, as you said, is Scotland welcomes Ukrainian refugees, and that's a really important message to get there. And I think Ukrainian people really appreciate that. And Scotland will always be welcome. It will always be welcome. It has a history of welcoming refugees from various war-torn areas. So Scotland will always be welcome.
It's an absolutely astonishing number to go from 3,000 multiplied by the factor of almost 7, and then find ourselves absorbing in and opening our arms to a quarter to a third of all the refugees that may come from Ukraine into the United Kingdom, and once again demonstrates just exactly what one nation practically means for Scotland.
Yeah, very much so. And there was an event in the Parliament last week from people from Ukraine. So there was a few refugees across, but mainly the Scottish-based Ukrainian people. And listening to them themselves, how thankful they were of how welcome Scotland was, really made a difference. We're talking about family members that they were bringing across and so on, and it's really impacted on the Ukrainian, I suppose, people that live in Scotland, the Ukrainian community, but it's much appreciated. Actually, speaking to people who actually have family over there and have had family brought over, it really makes a difference to their lives. And so I know the Ukrainian community in Scotland is very, very appreciative of the work that the Scottish Government have been doing in this.
Of course, the Ukrainian community and most of us will all have our eyes on the Supreme Court, where the hearing on the referendum by the Lord Advocate opened today. And this is whether the Scottish Parliament has the legal right, to bring forward an advisory referendum on Scottish independence. The reference to the Supreme Court was, of course, made by Lord Advocate Dorothy Bain QC in order to clarify whether or not the effect of holding an advisory referendum would be out with the powers of the Scottish Parliament. The UK Government has asked the court to refuse to hear the request, insisting that Scotland cannot hold an independence referendum without UK Government permission, which has until now been refused. Whilst the Scottish Government insists it does have the power to hold such a referendum. If the Supreme Court rules against the Scottish Government, it will of course raise questions about the nature of the so-called voluntary union of nations which make up the United Kingdom. And Paul, of course, it would be surprising if after the weekend that people were unaware of the Supreme Court hearing, but also it seems to be particularly odd that the nature of a voluntary union would suggest that one country holds sway in such a way over another, but this is where we're at.
Yeah, I mean, if the UK Supreme Court rules against, the Scottish Government, you have to ask the UK Government and those who vote no. If this isn't a way, what is a democratic way for people in Scotland to show their democratic right to have a referendum on whether they want to remain part of the United Kingdom or not? There is no democratic right. And the UK Government know that. That's why they're looking to get the Supreme Court ruling that they can't actually rule on the case itself until there is a bill passed. So I think it shows a weakness in both their democratic argument, and I think it will show the weakness in terms of where they are in terms of legally as well. But if not a democratic referendum voted by a democratic majority of MSPs in the Parliament who wanted voted a pro-Indian majority in last May, then what way is there for Scotland to show its democratic right? There is no way, and that for me is the failure of the Union, the failure of a broken United Kingdom, that they have to go down this particular route and don't give the right of people in Scotland to vote on their own future. It's not a voluntary union, and if you ask that question to any unionists, they can't come back and say that it is, because it isn't. It absolutely isn't.
I think one of the things that's quite interesting, of course, is that they're actually moving to stop this even being discussed, which would underline the democratic deficit. And I wonder just exactly how unionists within the confines of Scotland would be able to ever actually defend that, not even allowing people to present their case or present their argument within a legal context.
Yeah, I've heard it in the debate in the Parliament. Obviously, the First Minister makes that well known in debates that whereas do all of us, who support independence, be it the SNP or Greens, you'd never hear a legal argument that comes back from either the Labour Party, the Greens, or the Lib Dems. You often hear now's not the time, and so on, but they can't come back legally or in the terms of a democratic deficit because they know that it doesn't exist. In terms of the argument doesn't exist. There is a pro-Indie majority in that parliament that was voted for by the people of Scotland, and you often hear the unionists come back and say the SNP want this, the SNP want that in terms of a referendum. No, the people of Scotland voted for a pro-independence majority parliament, and the people of Scotland who voted that in should have the right to decide on their own future. You will never hear a coherent argument come from Labour or Tories or Lib Dems in that case, because all they say is now is not the time. They have no legality, no democratic legality around about what they're trying to propose. And that, I think, will come back and impact on when we do have the referendum. People will see that, and there will be growing support in the back of this, I believe, in terms of whatever way the referendum, the decision by the Supreme Court goes.
Certainly, in terms of coherence and coherent arguments, the UK government were in battle today with heightened international criticism, which has intensified as the IMF has criticised the British Chancellor once again over their tax and energy package. Kwasi Kwarteng was under fresh fire from the IMF after the Washington-based organisation said his tax cuts and energy support package had made the Bank of England's battle against inflation more difficult. The IMF used its prestigious World Economic Outlook to criticise the scale of the stimulus provided by the Chancellor and the blanket nature of the price cap on gas and electricity bills. It said the UK was on course for a sizable shutdown in growth from 3.6% this year to 0.3% in 2023, but said its forecast had been made before Kwarteng delivered his mini-budget on the 23rd of September. They were quoted widely as continuing to say, the fiscal package is expected to lift growth somewhat above the forecast in the near term, while complicating the fight against inflation. Financial markets expect the Bank of England to raise interest rates, currently at 2.25%, by at least 0.75% at its next meeting, which is due in early November. The Bank of England today was also forced to intervene again in the bond markets, a third time in 2 weeks, as market jitters resurfaced. Criticism within the United Kingdom included comments from the SNP's Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis, who said, the latest criticism from the IMF over the Tory government's disastrous budget is damning. It's unacceptable that rather than heeding the warnings and acting to properly support households and businesses, the UK government instead simply buried its head deeper into the sand. With warnings mounting each day over the real threat to people's incomes, pensions and homes, it's clear that only with independence will we be able to escape harmful Westminster control and get rid of the Tories for good. She continued, the Tory Reconomics of Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng is delivering a hammer blow to the economy and pushing millions of people into hardship. Paul, it's very hard to find anybody now who has not actually added their argument and condemnation both to the mini budget but also to the economic forecast and indeed the economic policy of the current UK government. It talks here about burying their head in the sand. Is there a sand dune anywhere in the UK big enough in order to accommodate just exactly how deep they're burying their heads?
No, and I think obviously when we seen Liz Truss during the Tory leadership debate, she was making these comments. Nobody thought it should actually follow through with some of these. I think once you've seen the announcement, you've seen how the markets reacted to that. Obviously, bringing forward the proposed tax cuts. Obviously, she U-turned on the higher rate of tax, but with no forecast behind it from the OBR. That's exactly why the OBR was there in that regard. So I think she showed her political naivety, but more damaging, I think she showed her economic naivety in terms of actually borrowing to fund tax cuts at the time when inflation is high and borrowing is high it's complete economic illiteracy. It was crazy decision, and I think you've seen how that's reacted since that's happened, and today on the back of the IMF, the markets, the Bank of England has had to step in today again with a more emergency measure to protect the pension funds that are there and buy back bonds when they were proposing to sell them just a matter of weeks ago before Liz Truss was appointed Prime Minister. So it's economic naivety, it's political naivety. But the important thing to remember is this is damaging people, as you said, in terms of the cost of borrowing, in terms of the mortgages, and in terms of inflationary pressures, as well as IMF mentioned in their report, it is going to push up inflation. There is no doubt about that. And the IMF have come out and said the only country that will have higher proposed projected higher inflation will be Slovakia. And it's again, the UK will have the highest inflation rate in the G7, and that's purely down to the mini budget by Kwasi Kwarteng and backed obviously by Liz Truss.
And just exactly what that means for borrowers has been highlighted today, because as the government economic measures are debated, worrying trends and rises in UK borrowers falling behind in mortgage payments was released as the boss of Santander UK says the bank is putting aside more money for potential defaults linked to the cost of living crisis, after seeing a pickup in customers falling behind in mortgage and loan payments. Mike Rainier has said that he was keeping a close eye on the strain and pressure facing customers as a result of the cost of living crisis, which has made it harder for some households to keep up with rising food and energy bills and financial commitments, such as home loans. That strain has clearly been compounded by rising interest rates and economic uncertainty, which has resulted in higher monthly payments for borrowers coming off of fixed-rate mortgages. Santander, the UK's fourth biggest mortgage lender, will increase its standard variable rate by 0.25 percentage points to 6.24% from the start of November, and its 2-year fixed-rate mortgages now command an interest rate of 6.04%. This is significant because Santander has about 11% of the mortgage market, a book of £184 billion worth of home loans as of July this year. It put aside £66 million for potential defaults in the second quarter, up from £52 million in the first 3 months of the year. Commenting, the SNP's housing spokesperson, Patricia Gibson, MSP, said, "The Tory government's budget has been an utter disaster, putting people's homes, pensions and incomes at risk and demonstrating once again that Scotland needs independence so we can escape harmful Westminster control and get rid of the Tories for good." The latest grim warnings of a rise in the number of homeowners falling behind on their mortgage payments must be a wake-up call for the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to get a grip of the economic crisis it has created by reversing the damage of its budget and acting to get mortgage rates back under control. Paul, these are astonishing figures, but ultimately at the end of the day, the only figure that really matters is what individual households are going to have to find in order to pay to stay with a roof over their head. And given the money that's been given out in terms of caps on energy costs, it would appear that they have given with one hand and they potentially are going to steal away with the other, so that people are very much worse off.
Yeah, and I think it kind of highlights the position that we are in Scotland. Obviously, the proposed tax cuts that came from Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. Obviously, I mean, only last week you seen Douglas Ross asking the Scottish Government to follow these. And now, if we had followed these, what position would we have been in? So, the Scottish budget is already under pressures because of the cost of inflation. I mean, £1.7 billion effectively has been taken off the value of the Scottish budget because of inflationary pressures that have been caused by the UK government and by its inept actions. And as you said, you've got energy costs, you've got inflation. Food inflation is higher than the normal inflation, which looks at other baskets of other indicators. So food inflation is estimated around about 13, 14, 15%. So if you combine energy costs with food costs and now the mortgage costs, anything that's been given away, which we won't see the effect of it is really pushing people to the brink, as you said, in terms of, and it's not, I'm not surprised that you're seeing people now looking at the possibility of more mortgage defaults. It's a perfect storm, and this has been caused by the UK government and its inept policies in terms of looking at that. And it comes back to the point, I think, that the First Minister made in her speech yesterday. In 2014, we were told about the economic stability of the United Kingdom. That's gone, and that's gone forever. And it's impacting on people in Scotland. And our task, obviously, in the SNP and the wider independence movement, is to convince people there is a better future in an independent Scotland. It couldn't get any worse under a broken United Kingdom financial system that we have right now.
And certainly bucking the trend, labour market statistics for June to August 2022 gave us Scotland's estimated employment rate rising over the quarter to 75.8%. This is the joint second highest employment rate in the Scottish series, with March to May 2019 and May to July 2017 all at 75.8% also. Scotland's estimated unemployment rate, conversely, fell over the quarter to 3.3%, and the estimated inactivity rate fell to 21.6% over the same time. Particularly pleasing was the employment rate for women between the ages of 16 and 64 in Scotland, which is the highest since the LFS series began in 1992 at 74.9%. Separately, HMRC early estimates show that 2.43 million payrolled employees in Scotland in September 2022, 41,000 more than in February 2020, which is prior to the pandemic. The Scottish Government has allocated almost £3 billion in this financial year on a range of policies which will contribute to helping households face the increased cost of living. Commenting, Employment Minister Richard Lochhead said, "The Scottish economy and labour market are continuing to show resilience, with the employment level the highest in the series and the rate increasing over the quarter to 75.8%. Additionally, the employment rate for women in Scotland was the highest since the Labour Force Survey estimates were published in 1992. He went further, reminding us of issues still having a significant impact on us by saying, "This is despite the serious challenges Scotland is facing as we recover from the pandemic, the ongoing cost crisis impacting businesses and households, the continued impact of Brexit, and the economic consequences of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, which all impact on the economy. The UK government's Brexit policies are continuing to cause labour shortages, which continue to have a negative impact on a range of sectors across Scotland." And Paul, it seems that we, within the context of Scotland at the moment, have a good news story which is somewhat obliterated by the bad management that seems to be in effect south of the border.
Yeah, it's encouraging news to see that's come through in that in all areas, particularly in the areas of employment for women. That's really good to see. And obviously we have to be aware of the predictions about the UK moving into recession and that the impact that it may have. But I think the figures, almost in a way, I think they're encouraging, but it almost looks at some of the other issues that we've got now, which in fact are looking at labour shortages. In my own constituency, I know this is shared across Scotland, we've got recruitment issues in terms of hospitality, in terms of care, in terms of the rural community and farming and so on. So there's specific issues that need to be addressed there. The Scottish Government has tried to look at that, for example, through the rural visa pilot, which would encourage workers from overseas to come in and look at a pilot around about looking at 12 areas in Scotland. We need that to maximise opportunities around about a rural economy and in terms of that. And again, that it does highlight the idiocy of Brexit, where we lost. I mean, the ONS forecast that the UK lost 1.3 million workers because of Brexit. That's about 130,000 in Scotland. That's around about 3,000 in my own constituency. So there is an impact still of Brexit that's doing there. And if we need to grow our economy in the longer term, we need the powers over migration to make sure we can encourage people to come in with appropriate skills into Scotland. So they're encouraging figures. There are things behind it, and we've talked about, such as Brexit, and we need to make sure that we can rejoin the EU as quickly as we can. But we should be pushing as quickly as we can within the devolved network set up to have powers over migration. So yeah, they're good figures, but there's much to be done in the background. And is the Scottish economy, I suppose, maximising its opportunities at the moment? No, because there are labour shortages caused primarily by Brexit.
And in further Commons news, the bill to reverse national insurance rises is passing through the House of Commons today. The bill to both reverse the 1.25% rise in national insurance and to cancel next year's health and social care levy will enter its final stages today in the House of Commons before moving on to the House of Lords. It was announced as part of the Chancellor's growth plan, the reversal of the national insurance increase, which was due to take effect from the 6th of November. Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng is pushing ahead with his other multi-million pound tax cuts for the wealthy, including, despite serious concerns over the UK's public finances, according to a report highlighting a boom for investor dividends since the COVID pandemic. And on a renewed day of turbulence in financial markets over the Chancellor's tax-cutting plans, the Treasury confirmed its own plans to reduce the rate of income tax on dividends. The move was announced by Mr Kwarteng during his mini-budget at the same time as the plan to reverse the national insurance rise, which had been previously launched by Boris Johnson. Both the rate of national insurance and dividend tax will be reduced by 1.25% by the move. However, research by the think tank, both Commonwealth and the Institute for Public Policy Research, showed investors had benefited from a boom in dividend payouts since the COVID pandemic at a time of meagre growth in workers' pays. The report found the tax cut would cost £600 million a year and would largely benefit the UK's richest individuals, while the UK government is considering slashing public spending by about £60 billion to pay for the mini-budget tax cuts. Last week, Chancellor Kwarteng U-turned on a controversial plan to abolish the 45p income tax rate for higher earners after a rebellion by backbench Conservative MPs, but he is continuing to face pressure to find savings amid a meltdown in financial markets over his tax and spending plans. Paul, a mixture of things in there, particularly what I found rather astonishing but not surprising is that boom in dividend payouts through the COVID pandemic, it would appear to have been good business for some. And what we are seeing is the possibility of slashing a lot of people's income through benefit cuts, when the Scottish Government seems to conversely, as was announced by the First Minister over the weekend, look at different ways of helping people pay for the cost of living crisis that they're facing.
Yeah, and this just highlights the, I suppose, the modus operandi of the UK government. It's like Robin Hood in reverse. That they're robbing the poor to help the rich. That is literally what they're doing, and they're shameless about it. Absolutely shameless about it. They don't try and hide it. In terms of that, as you said, I mean, the figures that have been quoted. Can you imagine how much an impact that would be? By helping the most poorest and most vulnerable in our society in Scotland and across the UK. What a difference that would make to people in terms of the rise in energy, because it impacts more on people who are on poorer incomes. It's a higher proportion of their income, as does food inflation, and so on. And we know the figures around about people choosing to heat or eat. And I visited my local food bank last week, and they're getting more and more inquiries in terms of that. They're getting more people actually saying that they're turning off their heating. There was estimates, for example, in various pieces of commentary saying that it could be up to a third of people could decide to turn on the heating off this winter. That's about 35,000 people in my constituency alone. 35,000 people who won't be putting on the heating this year. It's a perverse ideology that Liz Truss is pushing. Not only does she dress like Margaret Thatcher, she's got the same perverse ideology as Margaret Thatcher in terms of that. And it's absolutely, and if there was, if you want to look now around about what the main what are the main aims in terms of the United Kingdom and Scotland? They couldn't be any more diverse now. The United Kingdom government wants to help the most, the richest in our society. The Scottish government is mitigating year after year after year about helping the most poorest in our society because of UK government policies. Now, if that's a choice that people want to make, then for me, there's a clear choice. The only way we're going to help the most vulnerable in our society is by voting for independence.
And along with the Scottish Government and the UK Government doing battle within court, UK ministers are also facing the possibility of legal action over documents relating to the Queen's hidden wealth. They could face contempt of court proceedings unless they respond to a request for documents that could reveal how the late Queen concealed part of her private wealth from the British public. The UK Information Commissioner has threatened legal action against the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, which has stonewalled the request for 2 years. It has now until the end of October to respond to the Freedom of Information request or face court action. The documents requested may detail how the late monarch used a secretive financial facility to hide from the public the shares in commercial companies that she owned, along with the value of those shares. The size of her personal fortune, including her investments, has never been disclosed to the public. Estimates regularly speculated that it could amount to hundreds of millions of pounds. And as recently as last year, a report in The Guardian revealed how the Queen successfully lobbied the government to alter proposed legislation to prevent her shareholdings from being disclosed. As a result of her lobbying in the 1970s, the government created a state-backed shell company, Bank of England Nominees, which appears to have kept secret the Queen's private shareholdings and investments for more than 3 decades. In 1973, the Queen dispatched her private lawyer to lobby the government to change a proposed law that would allow the public to establish who owns shares in specific companies. Her lawyer argued that disclosure of her shareholdings would be embarrassing. The shell company, operated by senior individuals at the Bank of England, was set up in 1977 to hold royal investments, according to the document. The BEIS has failed to respond to Freedom of Information requests for copies of the shell company's annual reports, which had been sent to the UK government, despite public bodies being required to process requests under the FOI Act within 20 working days. The Information Commissioner has now ruled that the department has broken the rules of the Freedom of Information Act and ordered the department to deal with the request, warning that it could be taken to court if it failed to act before the 31st of October. Well, Paul, we all, of course, since the death of the monarch, have been feeling a warm and fuzzy feeling towards many of the royal family, but here is yet another example of those in such perhaps feeling that they are above the law, such as the contempt that some felt was shown by Number 10 during the pandemic in holding parties.
Yeah, you're right, and no one should be above the law, even the monarchy, if that's the case. And we've just talked about the impact on some, obviously some UK government policies. If King Charles obviously just coming in and taking over the monarchy, then I think one of the key things that's a challenge for him just now. He will obviously be briefed on this matter, and if he wants to see a modern, a transparent monarchy, he should open up the books of the royal family. There shouldn't be anything to hide, in that regard, and that I think this is a real quandary for him. I hope he will. It shouldn't be hidden from the people of Scotland, of the rest of the UK, in that regard. And I think, as I said, it's a decision that he will have to make. I think if he makes the wrong decision and it still looks to be, I suppose, keeping these issues secret, it's not a good look. No monarchy, no anywhere, should be above the law. So I hope he'll make a sensible decision. I hope he'll open up the books. And the royal family should be under scrutiny as is any other organisation. It should be, whatever your view of the monarchy is, it should open up its books. It should be open to scrutiny, and people should be allowed to ask questions.
And internationally, yet another country which has its own monarchy, the Saudi Arabians, is suffering a backlash in the US Congress after an influential Democratic senator threatened to freeze weapons sales and security cooperation with the kingdom after Saudi Arabia decided to support Russia over the interests of the United States. Anger towards the Saudi government has risen since last week's OPEC decision to cut oil production by as much as 2 million barrels. This was seen as a snub to the Biden administration and a nod to Russia because it is Russia who will benefit. Senator Robert Menendez criticised Mohammed bin Salman's decision to help underwrite Putin's war through the OPEC cartel. He also said there was simply no room to play both sides of this conflict. He added, "I will not greenlight any cooperation with Riyadh until the kingdom reassesses its position with respect to the war in Ukraine. Enough is enough." Another Democratic senator and a member of Congress, Richard Blumenthal and Ro Khanna, accused Saudi Arabia of helping to boost Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and said the United States should not provide access to strategic defence systems to an apparent ally of our greatest enemy. Paul, internationally, of course, we are about to see the World Cup football, which once again Scotland has managed to boycott in Qatar. There's a lot of discussions about sport washing along the whole of that sort of peninsula in terms of Formula One and boxing and so on. But here quite clearly is an economic decision being made within Saudi Arabia that could have very big impacts in the centre of Europe.
Yeah, there's complete hypocrisy from the United States and the UK government on this. We've seen the Saudi war against Yemen, and some of the biggest, and the UK is the biggest exporter of weapons to Saudi Arabia in that regard, and brush that under the carpet, if you like. Obviously, we've seen various deals with the US and Saudi Arabia over a number of years as well, because it benefits them economically. There is no morality in dealing with the Saudi Arabians. We've seen what happened with the murder of Adnan Khashoggi, which was again, which was very, very clear in what had happened. So there's complete hypocrisy in this regard. So I think the United States, the United Kingdom, has to be consistent in its approach to Saudi Arabia. It often, the dollar often obviously talks to both the UK and US governments in terms of that, and they should call out Saudi Arabians. Their human rights record is still absolutely abysmal. Make no doubt about that. And but yet we still see the UK and the US trading with them. Now, when it's beginning to impact on the US in terms of their foreign policy and in terms, obviously, of their economy, then we hear them coming back and saying that. But they need to be consistent. They need to be consistent. We have sanctions against various countries who have less or better, as said, human rights records than Saudi Arabia. So we need to be consistent in terms of that. It can't just pick and choose whenever it decides to criticise Saudi Arabia and then decides to benefit from selling arms to it. It's complete hypocrisy.
And we had the last 3 days ending at this SNP conference with the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, addressing conference. And this morning she was also addressing a loss and damage conference which had been convened by the Scottish Government in Edinburgh. She called on developed countries to step up to offering the extra finance to global South countries to better tackle the challenges of climate change, which she said were not of their making, while most had been caused by developed countries. The First Minister pointed out that people being displaced from their homes and losing their cultural heritage could not be replaced by tax levy or insurance. Ms Sturgeon said that the global South and emerging economies are paying for the price daily and that they are facing double insurance. Hence, developed countries should stop spending more time in these discussions that are taking too long and more delays are unacceptable. She commended the Danish government for joining Scotland, who were the first to pledge financial support. Vanessa Nakati, who was recently nominated as the UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador, spoke after the First Minister, emphasising the effects of climate change on the Horn of Africa, especially on women and children. Ms Nakati explained the children are not only robbed of their future, but of their present. She called upon world leaders to think about these children as they discuss and make decisions. She said that these marginalised and indigenous communities are deprived of their rights to clean water, healthcare, and other human rights. Professor Salim Hook, who is also part of the panel, said that he has attended all COP conferences and emphasised that the leaders should ensure money gets to where the money needs to get today. He urged the leaders to follow the First Minister's example on the commitment she has shown to the Global South and emerging economies. And just exactly what that commitment was, we can now show you as we have a clip of the First Minister's speech from this morning.
Thank you to all of you for joining us here for these extremely important discussions. Whether you're here in the room in person or one of the many that I understand are joining us online, we're really delighted that so many are taking part in today's conference. I'm particularly grateful to the UN High-Level Champions and the Global Resilience Partnership for helping bring this important event together. As it is now more than 30 years since the issue of loss and damage was first raised in international climate negotiations. Back in 1991, ahead of the Rio Earth Summit, the Alliance of Small Island States called for an insurance mechanism to be included in what would later become the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And they recognised, even back then, that loss and damage as a result of climate change was inevitable. And they proposed, rightly, that developed nations should pay into a pool to meet the costs that would otherwise be borne by island nations and low-lying developing states. Unfortunately, that proposal was rejected, marking the start of a campaign that has continued to this very day. There is no longer any excuse for anyone in our world not recognising the impact of climate change and the damage it is doing. And if we needed a very recent and very stark example of that, it has been, of course, the devastating floods in Pakistan. They underline the injustice that is at the very heart of climate change, that the countries who have contributed least to climate change are very often the countries that suffer most from it. Scotland is a relatively small country, but we are very determined to play our part, indeed determined as far as we can to show leadership in this space. At COP26 in Glasgow, almost exactly 1 year ago, we used our role as host and venue for that summit to support others in calling for action on this issue. And we also became the first country in the world to make an explicit commitment to provide funding to address loss and damage in other nations. Commitments then followed from some others, I think proving the power of those who are prepared to take catalyst action and lead by example. The establishment of the Glasgow Dialogue process offers hope, I think, in advance of next month's COP27, of much greater recognition of the need to address loss and damage. Finance for loss and damage should genuinely be additional finance. That means countries shouldn't and can't simply repackage funding that has already been committed to other climate priorities. And it also means, and I think this is an extremely important point, that finance from developed countries should not create debt for developing countries. Now that sounds basic perhaps, but it is important. People in the Global South and emerging economies are already paying the price of climate change every single day. So I hope all of you find the discussions that will take place here in Edinburgh over today and tomorrow informative and productive, and I hope they give you all a renewed sense of purpose and mission as collectively we continue to progress this extremely important issue. And I hope they will play a big part in ensuring that more than 30 years after this issue was first raised, COP27 will mark a turning point in the fight to address loss and damage.
Well, Paul, the First Minister there is talking about taking the lead, and there's certainly been an international flavour to much of what we have seen emerging in the news over today. The consistency here in terms of being a small nation that can contribute on an international stage seems to continue to be not just an ambition, but a reality, I think, that the Scottish Government is trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I think you look at Scotland's world-leading targets in climate change, you look at the move towards net zero, you see the lead in loss and damage, and I think Scotland is punching way above its weight in terms of that. And I'm proud we've got a Scottish Government that continues to do that. And I think, as the First Minister said, there is a challenge to the larger countries next month at COP27 in Egypt. They're in about getting on board with this. And ironically, we are seeing record spending on defence, on weapons in the last number of years. When we're seeing climate change impacting on the world, particularly in the global south, in the last number of years, increasing more and more, and we're just going to continue to see that, whether it's droughts in the summer or flooding in the winter. And we just seen the impact that's happened in Pakistan, where we've seen 33 million. It's incredible figures. 33 million people displaced because of the floods, and that will impact for the next 5 or 6 months until the floodwaters recede. So, it shows where the priorities of some larger governments are at the moment in terms of record spending on defence and not putting enough towards loss and damage and supporting the most vulnerable people because of the impacts of the global warming over the last number of years. So, they need to step up. They need to put the money in the pocket and try and support these countries as best we can.
And I think that one of the things that's quite interesting about it all, of course, is that whilst other governments came to enjoy the hospitality in Glasgow and sample the wares that were very much Scottish, that there is a global understanding within Scotland that the Pakistan floods are going to impact on a wide-ranging community within Scotland who will have family there, that the impact of what is happening in Ukraine in terms of those migrants and people who are coming into this country, and also the way in which Brexit itself has seen so many workers leave these shores and how that impacts upon those of us as a community who are left behind, means that we can no longer believe that the first cut should come when it is supporting other countries, as would be suggested by others. But, charity should not just begin at home. Charity should be something that, as a human being, we wish to spread as far and wide as is possible.
Yeah, and again, coming back, one of the first moves that Boris Johnson government made was cutting the international development budget from 0.7%, whilst they increased spending on defence. It's ludicrous priorities yet again. Cutting the budget to which was used to help the most vulnerable in society, and increasing defence spending. And the UK government have literally said they will increase that back to 0.7% when and if the economy is in such a position to support that. We're seeing the impact already of that, decisions such as this, and by other countries that are doing this. And more, the global warming hits, we're going to see these continue. And it will impact on refugees, it will impact on economic status throughout the world as well. And again, we should be as a society, and Scotland is playing its part, but the larger countries, the larger economies should be standing up and supporting the loss and damage proposals that the First Minister's put forward, and show where its morality is in terms of where we are, rather than spending more and more money in defence spending.
And from the global agenda in terms of the green environmental issues, we turn to more local environmental issues, as green spaces, rather unsurprisingly, have been linked to lower crime rates. The new research, which suggests maintaining green parks and gardens in cities has the potential to lower the risk of crime. The study found that more green space in a city is linked with lower risk against property, such as burglary, arson and vandalism, and less risk of violent offences. Researchers analysed data from 301 cities in the United States with populations of more than 100,000. The link between green space and lower property crime risk was found in 300 of the cities, with Cape Coral in Florida being the exception. There was a lower risk of violent crime in all but 3 cities, in Chicago, in Detroit, and New York. Importantly, this was the case when accounting for other factors linked to crime, such as demographics and poverty. Researchers at the University of Edinburgh, North Carolina State University, and Clemson University in the United States used data from the United States Census Bureau. They used a statistical technique known as multi-level modelling to investigate and predict the relationship between crime risk and green spaces using data collected from approximately 60,000 neighbourhood units. The researchers combined the census data with a number of other data sets, including crime risk and the FBI's crime and law enforcement statistics. The researchers also considered data relating to household income disadvantage. The study found the strongest positive predictor of violent crime risk was social disadvantage, in line with many studies on the causes of crime. Green space was a consistent predictor of reduced violent and property crime risk. Researchers say, although it is uncertain how exactly green spaces influences crime, the findings add more evidence to the benefits of having green space in urban areas. Well, Paul, we in Scotland have plenty of green spaces, but sometimes I think that we tend to fill them in with buildings within our urban areas and not really understand that it's not just social deprivation and poverty that's linked to crime, but also the lack of hope and positive mental health that comes from having a tree or 10 round about where you live. So it's hardly surprising that green spaces seem to have a positive impact.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think, being in East Lothian, but working in Edinburgh for many years, we had the Princess Street Gardens, which often worked in the city centre. We would often go down there at lunchtimes and just, I suppose, just chill out and reflect on the kind of day you've had in terms of that. So it was great to see that being used over, in everywhere. And I know that made a difference. I think around about the general well-being and mental health of people, which I think is an incredibly important part of how people feel about their own areas. And I think that tends to see examples. If people feel that their cities are being looked after, there is that green space where people can relax and chill out. I think there is that general better mental well-being than you would have if that area was concreted over, for example. So you can see that. And just today, I visited a walled garden in my constituency, probably about half a mile out of Harrington, which is a population about 12 or 13,000. It was an oasis. It was a garden. Maybe it was eight acres, which everybody can visit. It's open to the public. It's used by thousands of people a week who just want to get away, relax, and just, I suppose, get a little bit of putting life into perspective. So yeah, you can see why that works in that regard. And I think I'm glad that these results have been backed up in the study in terms of that. But you can see the influence, for example, at the Princess Street Gardens, just how much a difference that makes to people.
Yep. Well, thank you very much, Paul, and that is up for this evening. Can I first of all thank my guest, Paul McLennan, MSP. It's been an absolute delight and pleasure to have you this evening to talk through all the headlines and the details. But we here at Broadcasting Scotland, I just want to remind you that we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has already donated and to everyone who is signed up to make a regular contribution, a monthly payment, thank you very much indeed. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford as little as £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of adding 10,000 new subscribers to enable us to employ staff to make more programmes. And having seen what we can do with the conference broadcast that we managed over the last 3 days, over the last weekend, then I would hope that we've proven we have the ability to take this much further, but we can only do that with your help. So from me, Donald C. Stewart, here in the Glasgow studio, it's good night and thank you for watching.